Hello and welcome to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series, sponsored by the Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation. I'm your host, Ron Duffy. In these interviews, you'll meet successful business leaders and entrepreneurs who talk about what it takes to become a great leader and share their experiences building effective organizations with a Scanlon Plan. A Scanlon Plan is an innovative leadership process for total organization development. It consists of a set of assumptions about human motivation and behavior, general principles for management based on these assumptions, and specific procedures for implementing these principles. The Scanlon Leadership Network is a nonprofit association of high-performance, values-led organizations founded by Joe Scanlon and Dr. Carl Frost. Joe Scanlon was a steelworker and MIT lecturer who in the 1950s pioneered some of the first high-performance work systems based on the revolutionary idea that the average employee wants to work and has great creativity if given the opportunity. Dr. Frost carried on Scanlon's work at Michigan State University, conducting research and installing Scanlon Plans. Member organizations have won the Baldrige Award, the Shingo Prize, hundreds of supplier awards, and 5 have been ranked in the top 50 best places to work in North America. The Scanlon Leadership Network is considered one of the best-kept secrets in American business. The Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation brings this series of interviews to you as a public service to help leaders create better organizations for workers, consumers, and investors. Scanlon, where the best ideas come together. Our guest today is Bill Greenwood. Since 1987, Bill has been owner and principal consultant of Greenwood Consulting Services, which specializes in organizational leadership development, participative management, employee involvement, and company-tailored Scanlon gain-sharing plans. Bill often works in collaboration with the nonprofit Scanlon Leadership Network, focusing his professional activities on Scanlon Plan development, implementation, refinement, and research. Prior to his consulting experience, Bill held corporate positions as personnel planning specialist at American Hospital Supply Corporation and as Director of Human Resources for Herman Miller Incorporated. Bill Greenwood's educational background includes a BA in psychology from Dartmouth College and MA and PhD degrees in industrial and organizational psychology from Michigan State University. I asked Bill Greenwood to share his insights and views on leadership and what it takes for organizations to improve performance and become truly better places for people to work. And now, let's begin the interview. Bill, we are talking to you because of your expertise as an organizational development consultant with the Scanlon process. The Scanlon process, for our listeners, is a high-performance, is used to help create high-performance, value-led organizations. And you've been a change agent all your adult working life, and so we want to bring for our listeners who are involved in leadership positions in companies your unique perspective. And I think a way to start would be to ask you to briefly tell us how you got involved with the Scanlon process and organizational improvement / change processes.
Sure. I was very fortunate, Ron, back in the early 1970s when I came to Michigan State University to attend graduate school in industrial organizational psychology. On the faculty at that time was a person by the name of Carl Frost, a clinical psychologist who had worked with Joe Scanlon, the namesake of the Scanlon Plan, back in the late 1940s at MIT. He came to Michigan State to train people like me working in the field with corporations and companies and privately held and publicly held businesses and somehow implementing some of the innovative ideas that Joe had. And I was very attracted to it because in the classroom I was learning about leadership and goal setting and decision making and reward systems, and all of it was kind of in piecemeal fashion. And what I saw Carl doing in the field was putting it all together into a very coherent, internally consistent system that I later learned was what we call the Scanlon Plan.
Well, thank you. We're going to focus our time asking you to use one of the tools of a Scanlon plan, which is called the Scanlon Implementation Roadmap. It's kind of like a guide for going through an organizational improvement process, and there's actually 12 steps to that plan. And you and I, as we prepared for this interview, realized that it would be kind of cumbersome for the listener to just try to go over all 12 steps. So we're going to break it into 3 more manageable categories. And the categories are, we'll talk about change from top management's perspective, change for the middle management, and change that involves engaging the employees. But before we do that, there is some historical information about the Scanlon process, about early Scanlon processes, how this all developed, and I'd like you to start there.
Sure. I mentioned that Carl Frost and Joe Scanlon had collaborated back in the late 1940s at MIT, and if you were to visit a so-called Scanlon plan in the 1940s or 1950s, even into the 1960s, Ron, you would see that a Scanlon plan is a Scanlon plan is a Scanlon plan, and all I mean by that is they were very, very similar in structure. There typically was out on the factory floor, and we should point out in those days these were primarily blue-collar settings, factories, union situations predominantly because Joe Scanlon himself was a United Steelworkers Union leader. But what you would tend to find, and this was really radical if you think back to the 1940s, Joe believed in cooperation, not just adversarial relationships. And in the 1940s, management and labor cooperation really wasn't a word they used very often. But in these early Scanlon plans, you would see production committees, as we called them. These were typically the supervisor, or as those days referred to as the foreman, would work with some representatives of the people in his or her department trying to stimulate ideas. And it was based on the premise that nobody knows the work better than the worker doing it. And if a business needed help, why not ask the people for their ideas? So the production committee was set up in each department to stimulate those ideas and actually even to make some decisions about whether those ideas might be implemented. So each production committee was given some discretionary authority, budget authority, to implement ideas right then and there. And you would see these committees throughout the plant. But there would also be something called a screening committee, and this was a diagonal cross-section of representation from throughout the plant, always led by the top manager, and they would oversee and screen, which is the reason for the term screening committee, the suggestions that came up from the production committees. Every suggestion got at least 2 hearings, one at the production committee level and one at the screening committee level. The screening committee also had the responsibility to take a look at the overall performance of the plant in the last 30 days, because this was typically a monthly meeting. And the reason for that was so that people knew performance, but also so that they knew what the problems were in performing, which would serve as the stimulus for the next month's suggestions. The final thing that the screening committee did was they kept score. They actually were tracking the labor productivity, and early Scanlon plans were very focused on labor productivity. And by that, we mean they measured 2 things. What did we produce, and how much did it cost us in labor to produce it? If they could beat that target, that historical benchmark of that ratio between the sales value of production and the labor cost to produce it, that created savings. And those savings were shared between the company and the employees. So though it wasn't called gain sharing in those days, that was the very early beginning of what we now refer to as gain sharing. If the gains are achieved, they are shared between the company and employees. And as I say, every Scanlon plan in those 1940s, 50s, 60s vintage would have been very, very similar as I've just described those mechanics.
Is it safe to say in the early days this started out in manufacturing operations?
Yes, these were largely blue-collar, in part because Joe Scanlon himself came from that background, but organizations in those days, unlike today where we have almost more staff people, white collar and pink collar as we call them, in those days, inasmuch as labor productivity was the focus of the Scanlon Plan, it made sense to be looking at the factory situation, and that's where we found them predominantly in those days.
From those historical times, Bill, you've told me that 3 discoveries led to the use of what you call the roadmap, the implementation roadmap for a Scanlon process. Can you talk about that?
Yes, and again, I would give great credit to Carl Frost for really leading these discoveries as he helped us students learn in the field the experience that companies were having with the Scanlon Plan. What we began to discover in the 70s is that one size does not fit all when it comes to the Scanlon Plan. And the reason for that is that every company is so different. It can be different in terms of the composition of its population. It is different in terms of its products. It may be different in terms of its size. It may or may not have a union. There may be more office people than factory people, and so on and so on. They're in different markets. And so what we came to discover, and now it seems so simple, but at the time it was rather radical, that is that every plan needs to be tailored to the individual company. And as kind of an offshoot of that, and as a second discovery, inasmuch as Scanlon relies on the participation of the people in the company and all the people in the company, it really would be a contradiction in terms to unilaterally and universally apply the same plan to every company. Therefore, the people themselves need to be involved in the design. The third discovery, which really drives the design at the company-specific level, is that there are some common principles, however. I think that's the big difference between historical Scanlon, where we had common mechanics and structures, to modern-day Scanlon, where we have common principles that drive company-tailored processes to arrive at individual company mechanics.
I want us to talk about those principles because they're so central to the success of a performance improvement effort. Just to feed back what you're saying to me, the early Scanlon plans had mechanics, and what you mean by that is these production committees, the screening committee, and so on. These were the tools that were used to get the performance improvement.
And the other major mechanic, in addition to the committee structure, was the labor productivity bonus formula,
which became known as gain sharing?
Later, much later.
Okay, the labor productivity bonus formula. So if we did better, we found a way to share the rewards amongst the employees, the managers, and the investors that own the company.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned being faithful to the principles. In any Scanlon process, there are 4 core Scanlon process principles that are the basis for an organizational improvement effort. I'm going to say the 4 and just kind of say from the notes that I have, I'm going to say a key word about it and ask you to say a few things about it, Bill. The first key principle is identity. And the note I have about identity is that this relates to knowing your business reality.
Absolutely, and I think we should point out that as you describe these principles, Ron, we are describing them in sequence. Identity always comes first. We need to know the situation we are in before we can respond to it.
Okay, I'm going to add a few more things here and then ask you just to elaborate on it. So these are like building blocks. So if you're a leader of a company and you're saying, gee, we got to do better. We're in a competitive situation. We're in danger of losing our market share. We need to become better. If a leader wants to engage the Scanlon process of performance improvement, one of the first things they're going to have to get their heads around is the principle of identity and what that means. So I'm going to say a few more words about it. This is from Scanlon literature now. The principle of identity is based on 3 assumptions. Change is a universal given and is our only hope. A person's performance/behavior is a consequence of how they have been treated. And every person and organization is in the process of becoming better or worse. Can you add some more about that principle? There are some processes involved with that principle.
Identity has a number of dimensions. We can talk in terms of historical identity, and I think it's important for people in a business to acknowledge how they got to where they are, from a customer perspective, from an investor perspective, and an employee perspective. But I think they need to arrive at a common agreement and conclusion that as good or as bad as our history was, it's obsolete. It helps to explain how we got where we are, but it is not necessarily what today's reality is all about. And that brings us to the second dimension of identity, which is, we would say, what day is it in our business? What is the situation, and how compelling is it? And is there a compelling need to change? That really is the driving force that comes out of identity, that the current situation is not meeting expectations, and we need to do things differently. The third dimension of identity is, what must we become? You just mentioned in your description of identity, we're always in a state of becoming. Well, what must we become, and who helps us to understand what we must become? And our feeling is that it's the reality of the customer, the reality of the investor, and the reality of the employee that drives what we must become.
Okay, and I'm going to move us on now to the second principle of a Scanlon process. So this would be the second building block. The next principle is participation. And from the Scanlon literature, I'm going to say a sentence here. Participation is defined as the opportunity which only management can give, and the responsibility which only employees can accept to influence decisions in their areas of competence.
Yes, and I think it's critically important, particularly at the outset, for the leadership, but eventually for all of the employees. You've just described what participation is. It's a combination of opportunity, and it is the leadership that has to extend that genuine opportunity for people to be engaged. There are a variety of ways in which they can do that, and the most important one is that they be truly open to influence. If I really don't believe that people have ideas and can think and can help me and can lead me to make better decisions, I will not be open to influence and will not provide the opportunity. But the other side of the equation is that the employees themselves need to step up to the responsibility. It is not a good statement in a Scanlon company to hear someone say, "It is not my job." In some ways, that's a pretty stark indicator that people are abdicating responsibility and saying that's for somebody else to be concerned about. We'd much rather hear people throughout the business saying the customer is my problem. Profit is my problem. My own job security is not something anyone can guarantee. It's my problem. So you've hit right on it with that definition of opportunity which management provides, responsibilities which the employees accept.
And one other thing I'd add about participation principle, some of the practices, companies that get involved with a Scanlon improvement process, some of the practices that support participation are employee involvement, participative management, teams, suggestion systems, and so on. And, Bill, I think you'll be talking more about that.
The other point I would make about those various mechanics, as you described them, quality circles, suggestion systems, committees, and so forth, is in the absence of identity, which should precede participation, people will participate, but they might participate in the wrong things because identity has not been in place to help them see where their focus of attention ought to be.
The third principle, equity, is the third principle, and here's a sentence about that. Equity is defined as a genuine commitment to account for the needs of all constituents, including customers, investors, and employees.
And we have used a not particularly original symbol to try to depict graphically what we mean by equity, and that symbol is a triangle, and in particular an equilateral triangle. And what we're trying to help people to see, and incidentally, once employees at any level see that triangle, they never forget it, which I think is the real power of the symbol. But at each point in that triangle, we have a constituency, customer in one case, investor or shareholder in another, and employees in a third. And what we're trying to do with the concept of an equilateral triangle is to communicate that over time, and of course, in any given point in time, the triangle is probably out of balance. And of course, that's where the real energy comes to fix it. It's almost like biology and homeostasis, that it's always in a state of unbalance, and therefore we need to work real hard. It may be now we need to focus on the customer, but next year we need to focus on the investor because the triangle has somehow become out of balance. But what we like to say and have people understand is that our objective over time is to achieve a fair and balanced return to all three. And in the sense of the gain sharing that we talked about earlier, there should never be gain sharing unless we can demonstrate that all three constituencies are winning and winning at levels they've never won at before. And again, graphically, that means the triangle is not only in balance, but it's getting larger.
Okay, thank you. I'll add another sentence here from the Scanlon literature. The process of equity is accountability. Scanlon leaders regularly report the organization's performance relative to customers, investors, and employees' needs. I think that's what you've just shared with us. Some practices that support equity: gain sharing, goal sharing, profit sharing, balanced scorecards, tracking and reporting of performance results. And now I'll move us on to the fourth building block, the fourth principle for Scanlon process for improvement, and that is the principle of competence. Competence is defined as the ability to respond to the constant demand for improvement and change. It requires a commitment to be in a state of becoming something that you never were before.
In the early 1970s, Carl Frost published a book which was entitled The Scanlon Plan for Organization Development, Identity, Participation, and Equity. Note that in that title, there was no mention of competence. Competence was not one of the early identifiable principles, but it became so clearly obvious that as companies sought to implement identity, it was very demanding of competency, as you might expect, particularly of leadership, to help people to understand what reality is all about. Similarly, participation is not necessarily a commonly practiced way of managing, and it's demanding of a different set of competencies than the typical way of managing. So again, competency tended to separate the men from the boys in some ways when it came to their effective implementation of participation. Equity is demanding of competency in the sense that people throughout the business need to know the score. They need to know how they're doing. The database, the system that generates those results needs to be timely, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be accurate. So if companies are struggling with those basic systems problems, then they have an incompetency of another type. So we discovered that though identity, participation, and equity are sequential, identity before participation, before equity, competence is something that you need to have to effectively implement any one of those other three.
You are listening to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series. I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Bill Greenwood, Organizational Development Consultant, exploring topics related to leadership, the Scanlon business principles, and what it takes for organizations to improve performance and become truly better places for people to work. All right, thanks, Bill, for that kind of grounding us in the four core principles of Scanlon process for performance improvement. Now I'll move us on slightly here. A fundamental issue in addressing organizational and individual change is a natural resistance to change. How do these Scanlon principles in the processes that are associated with them address that?
Well, I think the four principles give us a tool for analyzing why in any given situation an individual or a department or perhaps even an entire company might resist change. If we look at it from an identity perspective, it may be that they're resisting change because they are not grounded in the situation. They don't know the reality. They don't know the facts, which would help them to see that there is a compelling need to do things differently. So that might be one way of analyzing, saying these people need better information and more reliable communication. A second reason why there might be resistance, and we look at the participation principle, is that people have not been engaged. They've been told what to do. They haven't been asked. Things have been done to them and not with them. And so naturally, we will resist when something's being done to us over which we have no influence. Third, if we look at the equity principle, the equity principle would kind of raise the question in any change situation, what's in it for me? That's a great question, and I think sometimes people view that as a selfish question, which it would be if we didn't also ask what's in it for the customer and what's in it for the investor at the same time. But again, if the change effort has not addressed that what's in it for us question, of course there will be resistance. And then fourthly, competency, it may be that people see the need for it, they've been engaged in it, they see there'd be something in it for them, but they feel unable or unskilled to be able to implement the behavioral change that's required, and they don't see the training or development there to help them do that.
When people contact you as a organizational development consultant, and somehow they've heard about a Scanlon process, and so they're thinking they want to do this, here's my question for you. Do they know what they're getting into? Or perhaps I can ask that same question in another way. Can you talk about the common misconceptions leaders may have about a Scanlon performance improvement process?
Sure. Inasmuch as Scanlon dates back to that 1940s set of mechanics that I discussed, and it includes two components that have survived to this day, one being participation and the other being a bonus or gain-sharing formula. The most common kind of misconception is that Scanlon is predominantly, if not exclusively, a bonus plan. That is, all we need to do is to somehow sit down with the accountants and come up with some kind of an incentive formula. Well, it's our finding that in most situations, incentive plans do not have a very long history. They eventually fail, and the reason they eventually fail is that they are implemented as an equity system without the corresponding and preceding identity system, which tells people what they need to do, and participation system, which gives them a way to do something about it. So in the absence of knowing and the absence of being engaged, bonus plans will fail. And so that's one of the kind of relearning steps we need to take and say, no, this is not just an incentive system, it's a comprehensive process. So that's one. Another misconception is that they can call us and kind of purchase the plan, and the emphasis being on the plan rather than a process for implementing a plan. They are used to contracting with consultants to come in and install something. Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, that's doing something to people, not doing it with them. And when you do something to them and not with them, then they don't own it. And if they don't own it, they don't take care of it. If they don't take care of it, it's not likely to have much survival either. A third kind of misconception, and often this is more a misconception of the employees perhaps than it is of the management, is that when we talk about participation, we're really talking about democratic management. That is, we are going to vote on everything, that management can easily be overruled. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about participative or participatory management, not democratic management. And what that means is that management still reserves the right and the responsibility and the accountability to make the final decision. But what management is saying is we will make far better decisions if we are influenced by the people who are closest to the situation, the closest to the work, who have the line of sight to the quality problem or the cost problem or the delivery problem. So management will decide, but if they're open to influence, they will make better decisions. And that leads to sort of another trap, although I view it as an opportunity, and this one relates more to management. To the extent that management says we will be influenced by employees in making our decisions, the employees find out very quickly whether management is true to the word, whether management is providing them with the opportunity, whether they're being influenced, whether they're giving rational explanations for the decisions that they're making. In other words, the whole decision-making process is far more visible and conspicuous throughout the business than it was before. And so we've had some managements who have been kind of they've thought twice about implementing participation when they begin to realize, my goodness, we're now going to be accountable to everyone for our decision-making, whereas in the past, maybe we're only accountable to our boss.
All right, Bill, thanks for that background about misconceptions that leaders might have about introducing a Scanlon improvement process. I want to move us into the discussion of the roadmap, correct me if I'm wrong now, but the Scanlon Implementation Roadmap is a tool. It's a 12-step process, and it's an important tool that you were very involved in helping to develop it and are an expert on this. Rather than break it down into 12 steps, which we thought might be too cumbersome, we're going to break it into 3 main categories. And we're going to talk about top management roadmap steps. We'll talk about roadmap steps that apply to middle management, and roadmap steps that apply for engaging the employees. And so let's jump into that first category, top management responsibilities. When we think about the Scanlon performance improvement process and we think about top management, what do you got to do?
Well, and the principles tell us at least where to start in response to that question, and that is with identity. And it is uniquely a leadership responsibility to help people throughout a company or throughout a business to understand what that company's mandates are. And I'm using that word very carefully and intentionally, mandate. Now, a mandate is not a goal, it's not a vision, it's not a strategy, it's not a mission. It is, in fact, a statement of what we must do. Mandate has an imperative quality to it, and we think that every company, whether it's a manufacturing business or a service business, has at least 3 dimensions of a mandate. And they are driven by those constituencies we talked about earlier. For instance, in every situation, you have customers who are mandating that you do certain things. It may be delivery mandates, it may be price mandates, it may be quality mandates, it may be service mandates, but your customers are saying to you as a business, here is what you must do for us, and the implications of doing them are one thing, the implications of failing to do them are quite another. Similarly, the shareholders are saying, we have expectations, we place demands, they are imperatives. It may be for growth, it may be for profit, it may be for efficiency, it may be for return on assets, who knows? It will vary from place to place. But each company needs to know what those expectations are and be very alerted to what the implications are of doing it and of not doing it. And finally, and not because it's last, they have employees who have mandates. And I think of employees as being investors in a business too. They invest their time, they invest their energy, we hope they invest their creativity in their careers, but they don't do it without an expected ROI. And so they say, this is what we must have from a job. It may be job security, it may be fair pay, it may be the opportunity to be involved. Again, it will vary from workforce to workforce. But it is the leadership responsibility to stand up and be accountable to defining very specifically what those mandates are. And the only way to know is to go out and find out, to spend time with the customer, to spend time with the shareholder, to spend time with the people, and then come back and report to the company at large and say, here is what my data tell us, not just tell me, but tell us. These are our mandates. This is what we must do. If we don't do it, there's a vision that I don't think anyone wants to realize. If we do it, then there's a vision that maybe we all aspire to. But the bottom line of the mandate, particularly when we look at what we must become, if we stack it up against where we are, there typically and almost universally will be a gap, and rather sizable gap perhaps, that says, where we are is not good enough, there's a compelling need to change. So the leader is doing the great service to all of the employees in saying, don't change because I say so and I'm the boss. Change because you're absolutely convinced by the facts and the reality of our mandate.
Bill, I'm reminded of some consulting work I was involved with about 10 years ago. I was teaching a 5-step improvement process to employees at power plants. And the particular improvement process, step 1, was called the imperative.
Yes.
And the imperative literally meant this team has to name the problem you're working on, and you have to tell us why the problem is a problem so that everyone understands that it's a problem. And I just noted the similarities here. Teams that got that clear had a much greater chance of success with their issue than teams that were kind of wishy-washy with this. And I think that's what you're sharing here. The leaders have to be crystal clear about what is the gap in our performance that we need to improve, why do we need to improvement, or it begs the question, why change?
Yes, and the only caution to the scenario that you described would be this. There are teams who will respond when you ask them to go work on a problem, but if you do that in isolation, they may work on the wrong problem, or the problem that won't have the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. So we go back to the identity responsibility of leadership. Before they ask the team to work on a problem, make sure that team is fully well-versed on the situation.
And this is leadership's responsibility, to know the mandate.
Not only to know it, but to communicate it in rational, convincing, and compelling terms so that the people who hear it really see that there is no other alternative but to change.
When we talk about top management, could you respond to this? A Scanlon process is top-down. It's a management-led process. You did say to me there's no guarantees at the outset that you will get past step one.
Well, and as you pointed out, the roadmap itself, which is a roadmap that has been put in place to help a company implement its own system that reflects the principles, is top-down because it is management's responsibility to lead and management's responsibility to make the decision. At some point, at each step in the roadmap, and as we've said, there are 12, the level that's involved, initially it's the senior level, we're talking about that now, needs to make a determination, are we able to do what Scanlon will require of us? That's a competency issue. Are we willing to do what Scanlon will require of us? And that gets at how do we believe is the right way and the wrong way to manage? And are we ready to take on what Scanlon is all about? And that may have to do with whatever else is going on in the business, or it may have to do with some major deficiencies that need to be corrected before we are ready. So it is possible, to your point, of when you start, you may never complete. At each step of the roadmap, those three questions, are we able, are we willing, and are we ready, need to be asked, and they need to be answered comprehensively and honestly, and it is not uncommon that once a company understands what they're getting themselves into with this system, that they say, no, we really aren't able, or we may be able, but we have some people, and they're critical people who aren't willing, or they may say, we have some systems work that needs to be done until we're ready. So it's not the wrong answer to say we're not able, willing, and ready. It could very much be the right answer, and the roadmap is designed to enable, at each step along the way, the people who are involved at that step to come to the right decision for them.
So, Bill, for example, if you're working with somebody on the mandate and it's discovered that, we just don't have the clarity that we need to go to the next step, and you would say, well, I guess you better stop here. Correct me now if I'm not understanding this right.
That's correct. In fact, I can think of one situation where it was a company that had historically been a great performer and led its industry. But one of the consequences of that leadership over a period of time is that they developed complacency, that nobody could touch them, that they were far and away the leader, and they would remain that way inevitably and forevermore. Well, what they came to discover in the development of their mandate is that they were very far removed from their customers. They really didn't know how the marketplace had changed. And therefore, the president made the commitment to the entire organization, well, until we really know, we're operating with a significant blind spot. And so I, as president, will commit in the next 6 months to visit all of our major customers and come back to you with a report. Thank goodness he did it, because they discovered in the process what they didn't know, and particularly what they didn't know about how close the competition was breathing down their necks.
Would you say they've stopped the process, or they're just working that step until they're ready to go on to the next step?
Clearly the latter. They're not stopping the process. And if they do the process correctly and comprehensively, they're far better positioned to proceed when the timing is right.
Have I also understood you in our previous conversations to say that even if they never formally followed the Scanlon process from that point, they're better off than they were because they know an issue that they've had to address?
Yes, and it's been through their own process of discovery, not through the consultant coming in and saying, you've got a problem.
Okay. Any other example of a mandate from a particular business you'd like to share?
One business that is probably familiar to all of us is the telephone industry. And if those of us who were around back in the 1980s will recall when there was only one game in town, and that was AT&T, who had no competition. And so consequently, they didn't worry too much about the customer. The people we worked with were the long-distance operators at that time. And in 1983, along came divestiture, which for the first time in the history of the telephone industry created competition. And that was the beginning of companies like Sprint and MCI and so on. And whereas in the past, the long-distance operator was literally trained to get rid of the customer as quickly as you possibly can in the interest of efficiency and profitability and bottom line, with competition, along came some sensitivity for the first time to satisfying the customer. So as the management and union leadership, in that case, the Communication Workers of America, worked on a statement of mandate, one of the very important things for them to do was to help people see that we do have an equilateral triangle. It's not just a matter of satisfying the investor and driving efficiency and getting rid of the customer regardless of how satisfied they are. We have a new mandate dimension, and that is to satisfy the customer at the same time we're managing the balance of profitability and our own job security. Back to the equilateral triangle again.
Mm-hmm. And these are all issues that would fall under the category of identity and knowing your business reality.
Yes.
Okay. I'll move us on here. I'm just going to ask, you've talked about readiness in terms of top management. Anything more you'd want to say about readiness?
Well, I think there's an important point to be made here, and that is it may be very easy to convince people through the mandate development process that the business needs to change, that the company needs to change. But as we all know, nothing changes unless people change. And so what often happens, either implicitly or explicitly, is that the leader goes to the organization with a very eloquent statement of the need to change organizationally. But it's quite clear that until leadership changes, and at least leadership initiates the changes, not much is going to happen. Our friend, who is the Japanese fellow who took our systems to Deming, said that management is 80% of the problem. Well, I don't think you have to take a vote on that in most organizations. The people will say it's at least 80%. So what that means is when it comes to readiness, the leader has to model the change. The leader cannot go to the people and say, I'm okay, you're not okay. The business is in trouble, that's not my problem, that's your problem. It's an expectation that leadership will say, here is what I will commit as your leader, and we as a senior group of leaders will commit to do differently. Now watch us. This is not the flavor of the month. We may have promoted other programs in the past, but that's all they were, programs. We're saying, we are going to commit to you a behavioral change of leadership. And, you know, to really test that, they sometimes have to get in a room all by themselves as leaders and say, what are we going to do differently? What will be convincing to the people that we understand the mandate, that we understand its implication for us, and that we are willing to make some significant movement in the way we manage? Well, in one case, an organization was going through this process, and as they thought about what Scanlon might mean, it conceivably would mean that as the people got turned on, they'd become more productive. They'd be able to generate more production capacity. Well, the sales marketing VP felt that if he didn't somehow fill that capacity with more sales, then these people might work themselves out of a job. So he said, well, you know what I'll commit to the 1,200 people in this business is we will go out and sell whatever additional capacity they create through their productivity improvement. Well, I think he thought he'd get applause, and instead he got deadly silence until one of the other colleague vice presidents spoke up and said, Harry, you don't understand the difference between sales and marketing, and you never have. Our problem is not going out and selling the obsolete production we're building into inventory. The problem is we're not developing new products fast enough, and you are not bringing back the message that would give us all confidence that we have a future in new products. Well, Harry lasted another 30 days in that business, and he was gone. What the process had unearthed and made conspicuous was there was an incompetency, or if you will, lack of readiness. So Let me be clear, it can be a very confronting process, but it needs to be.
Us on to what might be some examples of key behavior changes by management. I've got some notes here. I'll say some things and ask you to pick up on it or not. One of the tools is called open book management. Another one here, you've been talking about it, manage accountability, make performance visible, take action where there is non-performance, and where there is performance, recognize it.
Accountability is an interesting concept, and our finding is, Ron, that in many businesses, accountability has a negative connotation to it. And I think that's because of the way it has been used. You know, that something goes wrong and the fingers get pointed, you were accountable, or the question get asked, who was accountable, or the statement is made, there's no accountability around here. And so when the term gets raised in many situations, people kind of shy away from it. And yet, my feeling and our finding is that the only people who need fear accountability are the people who are not accountable. That we should look at accountability as a very positive performance management process. And we tend to think that accountability has three dimensions. First, it has commitments. We got to say what we're going to do. Secondly, it has to have counting. We have to measure whether we did it or we didn't. And thirdly, there have to be consequences for performing and for not performing. Now, most of the time, we like to think there will be performance, and people should be recognized for that. You know, the behavior that's rewarded will be repeated. That's a basic concept of psychology. And at the same time, because performance is so much more visible, and because people's own stake is greater under the Scanlon Plan, they need the assurance that the leadership will manage non-performance as well. That doesn't mean firing everybody, but it does mean calling people on that non-performance, making clear what performance needs to be there, and then providing a reasonable amount of time for that to take place.
Okay, Bill, in the interest of time limitations, I'm thinking of moving us on to the next kind of main category of this Scanlon process, the roadmap, and that's how it affects middle management and what are middle management responsibilities. We've been talking about top management responsibilities for implementing change. Unless there's something else you want to say in that category, I'm going to move us on to middle management.
Sure, we may come back as need be.
Okay. I'm going to start us off with this tongue-in-cheek expression that I made a note about that came from you, and this is the quote. Participation is something the top orders the middle to do for the bottom.
And when we give that definition, it often evokes chuckles in any audience, but particularly when you are addressing a middle management audience, because they have become accustomed over time as the muddle in the middle, if you will, of falling victim to leadership at the top becoming very excited about something, usually a program of some kind, that they've either read about or they've had a colleague do in another business or a consultant has sold them, and they come running into the organization to the middle management and say, and we'll use Scanlon as the example, although it's not a very appropriate one in our case anyway, they come in and say, by January 1, 2008, we will have a Scanlon plan. And the implicit expectation is that middle management will just fall into line, that they are, since they are part of management, they're expected not to challenge, they're expected to help lead. Well, our experience is that these people in the middle have become very adept at responding to that kind of thing because they've seen programs come and go. And they've learned that if they just kind of sit still long enough, don't embrace it, just sort of let it happen to them, eventually it too will die because they've not been engaged in the process, nor do they see anything in it for them. So I think it's the responsibility when leaders have in mind doing something like Scanlon, that they go to this very critical group of people in the middle of the organization who on a day-to-day basis are managing the operation and say, now we think we have a mandate and we want you to know what it is, because it's the whole reason that we are promoting anything. We think we have maybe a way of responding to the mandate, and it's this series of principles and a roadmap process to help get us there. But we're not telling you. We are asking you. And what that may mean in application, Ron, is that after senior management makes its case for the mandate and makes its case for why Scanlon might be the way to respond to the mandate, that they send these middle managers off on their own to discuss what they've heard. And sometimes we might even prompt them with some questions to discuss while they're away. And that is, what do you think? Is there a need to change? Why would you think so? Why might you not think so? What do you think? Do you think your job would have to change? How might it have to change? What help would you need to implement that change? What do you think? Do you think there's anything in it for you? What would have to be in it for you? What kind of help can we give you at any level? What do you think? Do you think the senior management's serious about this? How do you think this is different from XYZ plan that we put in the past? Well, whether you prompt them or not with those questions, if you give them a genuine opportunity to stew on them and to come back with their anonymous feedback on them, our finding is that they are absolutely ruthless. I can't think of a better word in their feedback. And they'll come back and say, no, wait a minute, how is this different from last month's flavor of the month? Wait a minute, you say one thing, but we can give you multiple examples of doing another. Have you been sold a bill of goods by a consultant? Why this plan and not another plan? Can we go visit our counterparts in other companies to see how it would work for us? Or, the most common one is they'll come back and say, we've been trying to change things around here for 25 years, and we can't get the simplest thing done, so it looks to us like you're just jumping right over us and going right to the employees. You expect us to manage them being open influence when indeed you're not open influence to us.
So this feedback, Bill, is ruthless, and I think you've said to me the response by the top management to this feedback from middle management is key for continuing.
Absolutely, because I think what they're doing when they come back is they are testing whether the influence opportunity is real, because what management is promoting with Scanlon is an opportunity to influence. Well, here's the first opportunity out of the gate for the middle management to influence whether or not the mandate is convincing, and whether or not the proposed Scanlon process is convincing, and whether or not the middle management sees any reason to be engaged. And if they discover in this very first test that leadership is not open influence, that in fact they are going to unilaterally railroad this thing through, you've lost them. And all you've done is to validate for them that this is nothing different from what they've experienced in the past.
So as a consultant, what do you advise top management on how to deal with this ruthless feedback?
This is the most difficult step when we talk in terms of how long does it take to implement a Scanlon process. This particular step is the most difficult to call in terms of the time that might be involved, because obviously by the time you get to this step, the senior management has momentum and they're ready to go. But if the middle management is not, they can't be rushed. And this is our counsel to the leadership, make sure you are hearing what middle management is telling you. Ask for their opinion. Make sure you are hearing it, first of all. Then secondly, play back to them what you are hearing so that they know whether or not you've heard them accurately. And then thirdly, make clear how you've been influenced by what you're hearing. And if you have been influenced by what you're hearing, it probably means you're going to pause in the process and address the issues that middle management is raising.
Is there an example from your work that you could relate that relates to this area?
Well, at some point, the leadership will say, we simply will not do this if you don't think it's the right thing to do. And in one organization, there were about 18 to 20 middle managers, and the CEO of the company said, and he had a reputation, incidentally, historically, for being pretty unilateral and arbitrary. He said, we will not do this if you don't agree to do it 100% on a secret ballot vote. Well, that is really changing the dynamics of the decision-making. It is really empowering the middle management. They realize that, wow, he's not telling us, and in fact, just one of us who might dissent could hold up the whole process. They aren't sure they believe it, but it is a bold statement to be made. And in fact, that's what happened. They got to a point where the middle management believed they were ready for the vote. And in fact, they thought they had a unanimous position and discovered that they had one person who voted no. And that one, and it was an anonymous vote, so at least the president didn't know who it was. And of course, he was quite miffed by that result. But the interesting thing about that was it was middle management's problem to solve. I think the middle management looked to the CEO and said, okay, we've given you 19-1. What are you going to do about it? He looked back at them and he said, no, it's not my problem. It's yours. And they said, okay, we'll take care of it. And so they managed the process, and it took weeks, but they worked their way through it and held another vote, and they were unanimous.
Interesting. Okay, anything more you would say with regard to middle management and the Scanlon process? I have a note here that says, what would middle management be asked to do differently?
There is a famous writer by the name of Douglas McGregor who wrote a book called The Human Side of Enterprise, and in it he described what he labeled Theory X and Theory Y. And Theory X was a set of assumptions that managers hold about how to manage people and about people in general. And those assumptions are like people are naturally lazy, people need to be watched, people need to be coerced, people will not accept responsibility, people shun decision-making opportunities, and so forth. He had a corresponding and conflicting Theory Y, which said, no, for people, work is as natural as play. They will naturally gravitate toward responsibility and engagement. They will be self-monitoring and don't need to be controlled. Well, McGregor went on to say that people's behavior is a consequence of how they're managed. So if you treat people as though they are Theory X and need to be watched and coerced and won't accept responsibility, they won't surprise you. They will live down to that expectation. If, on the other hand, you treat people as though they will become responsible over time if given the opportunity, they will live up to that assumption. That particular learning is critically important for middle managers who are managing large groups of people to understand. The middle manager needs to understand under what set of assumptions are you operating. Are you a Theory X manager? And if you are, we can almost predict what kind of response you'll get from your people. If you want to become a Theory Y manager, you might be surprised at the new response that you get. And for some middle managers, they're never able to make that transition. And if there are a sufficient number of those middle managers, that gets back to the question of readiness. That company is probably not ready to take on Scanlon.
And that would surface in this process, and would the process stop at that point?
Well, it would depend, of course, on the magnitude of the problem. But I think what we need to do in that case is anticipate that this will be a difficult transition, that these people will need help, and there are any number of outstanding programs out there, training and development programs, to help with that transition. So I think we make the assumption that people are going to need the help and make sure they get it up front rather than wait for them to fail and then be discouraged.
So would it be part of top management's responsibility to say this may be a competence issue and we've got to address it with training and education on how to become a Theory Y manager?
Yes, and it's not only, and in saying it's a competence issue, we are not blaming the middle managers. They too are the consequence of how they've been managed.
Mm-hmm.
So if they are Theory X, they weren't born that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you acknowledge that a change is required, and we're going to help all of us with that change.
So one of the things I'm picking up, Bill, is, it's a very dynamic change process, and there may be anywhere along the way, it may take one company longer to go through a particular step in the process than another, depending upon the dynamics and the situation and the understanding of the people involved in the company.
And the roadmap is designed so that they determine what the right pace is. They do not proceed to a subsequent step until they have convinced themselves with data or behavior that they're ready.
Okay, and if you went beyond the step that you're ready, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And if you stick to the step that you're supposed to be on, you're setting yourself up for success.
Yes.
You are listening to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series. I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Bill Greenwood, Organizational Development Consultant, exploring topics related to leadership, the Scanlon business principles, and what it takes for organizations to improve performance and become truly better places for people to work. Okay, the third main category or conceptual framework for this roadmap is engaging the employees in the Scanlon process of improvement. My notes say in our discussion that you said a company may never get to this step. It depends on the behavior and understanding of senior management and middle management and how far they've been able to take it. Have they been able to internalize this change of mind about how you do business? I made a personal note here. In some sense, that seems sad to me because the people closest to the work are those that most probably want to see change, and yet they're really not in a position to initiate it to begin with.
We go back to Dr. Deming's position that management is 80% of the problem. I really think that until the people have seen evidence in behavioral terms that it is a new way of managing, it is unfair to expect the change from the people. And they will say that in so many words. You're absolutely right that the people will be frustrated. One of the big mistakes that leadership can make at the outset of looking at Scanlon is to commit or to promise to the workforce as a whole that we are going to have a Scanlon plan before ever embarking on the steps where they determine readiness. That paints management into a very difficult corner if they discover along the way that they're not ready. So by the time you get to the people, if you have done your homework correctly, now we're at that third major chunk that you're talking about, Ron, if senior and middle management have been faithful and rigorous and disciplined to the process at this point, they are able, willing, and ready. And they are able to demonstrate that in fairly convincing terms. But they, too, as with senior management going to middle management, when they go to the people, they present first why we need to do anything. They never start with, we think we need a Scanlon plan. No, that's a how. Let's start with the what. What must we become? What are we today? What's our mandate? Do you agree with us that there's a need to change? That ought to be the first focus of discussion with the people. In fact, we even have them vote on that question. Are you convinced based on the facts of the situation? You know, when I talk to groups of employees, and I love to do it, I always say the worst reason to change is because the boss says so. The best reason to change is that you're absolutely convinced by the facts that we have no alternative. So if the management has done its job, it has made that point clearly. There is no alternative. We must change. And we like to see at least a 90% affirmative vote that the company people agree we got to do something.
You're telling us that if the company, if top management and middle management has really done their homework on the identity principle, you're talking about things related to the business reality.
Right.
Then this is the information you're going to convey to the employees, and then with that accurate knowledge, they can make an informed decision.
Right, and I've never had a case in my 25 or 30 years of experience where if the management has done its homework up to that point, that they were not able to convince the people.
A couple other concepts here I'll ask you to respond to. When you're presenting this to the employees, you've mentioned to me that a supervisor often is the one who presents it to the Scanlon ideas to small groups. And why is that? And why is that important? And then if you'd spend a few minutes just saying, well, if the employees say, yeah, let's go for this, give us a typical example of how this happens.
Sure. Well, we think that the supervisor of the employees who are being addressed, and usually these meetings are held in small groups, departmental groups preferably, they always kind of wonder where's the supervisor coming from. They like to hear from the CEO, but they know on a day-to-day basis if there's going to be change, it's going to have to include their boss. And so we always encourage that as part of the presentation of the mandate, as part of the presentation of the proposed way of getting there, that is Scanlon, that the supervisor stand up and say where he or she might be coming from. And we found that the most convincing speeches, because they are real, is not when the supervisor stands up and says, well, when I first heard about this Scanlon plan, I thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I immediately embraced it, and I'm ready to go. That's not what happens. What happens instead, and what the supervisor really should be saying is, when I first heard this, I was skeptical. And I have lots of reasons historically, usually, for my skepticism. I had lots of questions. Here were the questions I had. Here were the people I asked those questions of. Here are the companies I went to visit to see if this thing is for real. Here is where I am today, and here's why I've changed my mind and think that you should explore it. I'm not fully committed yet, but I want to explore it to the next step. And that's what happens. If the people are convinced there's a need to change, and if they're convinced that this process shows some promise, and they're told that if we are to have a Scanlon plan, the consultant's not going to do it. Senior management's not going to do it. Middle management's not going to do it. We're going to have to form our own cross-functional, diagonal cross-section of our business, representatives of our people, whose task it will be, in consistent with Scanlon terms, to come up with an identity system, that is a system for communication, a participation system, that is a system to engage people, to identify problems, solve problems, implement solutions, an equity system, that is a system for keeping score, managing accountability, determining whether there's gain sharing or is not. These are very specific mechanics. And identify some of the new competencies that will be required. And if it sounds like I just identified the 4 principles, again, I did. It's the job of this employee committee, led by management, again, because it is participative, not democratic, to come up with a proposal of a new way of operating. And I should point out that by the time they develop that proposal, they will probably give it a name of their own. They won't call it Scanlon, because Scanlon has been around for 60 years, and Joe Scanlon's been dead since the mid-1950s, so they give it a name that is very much their own. We have one company that calls it the ICE plan for investor, customer, employee. Another that calls it Unite, using new ideas to excel. These are documents. They are written by the people. They go back to the board of directors, because the board of directors has to approve on behalf of the shareholders. The management has to agree to it, because after all, they have ultimate decision-making authority, but they've been influenced by the people. And then there is a company-wide vote on whether or not to implement the proposed plan for a trial period, which usually is in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 years. They go back at the end of the trial, they revise it based on their experience, and they may vote again on whether or not to continue it.
All right. Well, Bill, thank you for that explanation of how something, how a Scanlon plan or the plan that each company gives its own name folds out over time. There's to end our thing, I just have some general questions that I'll ask you for brief responses. What would you say is the top couple reasons why organizations succeed with a Scanlon change process, and alternatively, what would be the top couple reasons why they might not succeed?
One of the reasons when we think about success, there's always that question, what's the definition of success and what's the definition of failure? Usually what happens if Scanlon fails, it doesn't automatically, one day you got it and the next day you don't. Usually what happens is it dies on the vine. It's a slow death, which is a particularly insidious one. And that usually means it's because it was not managed like anything else in a business. Every year we need to improve the Scanlon process just as we improve all of the other processes in the business. So what I'm saying is you can't drive a stake in the ground the first time you design a Scanlon process for yourselves and say this is it forevermore and not allow it to evolve. If the Scanlon process does not evolve, then it will become stale and it will fail. So we need to build in renewal processes. So those companies that have these built-in renewal processes are more likely to succeed than those that don't. Another, I think, determining factor in success versus failure is if the plan itself is driven by reality rather than by edict. Now, what happens in many organizations, Ron, as you know, is there are changes in leadership. It's not uncommon in some situations that the leader will move on or the leader will be promoted and someone else comes in, and that someone else may have his or her own ideas about a change process. Well, that has lots of implications, one of which is you try to bring in people who are compatible, but you hope that it is always the reality of the situation that's driving it, not the personality of the leader or the edict of the leader. Where we have very dominant personalities who come in and try to supersede reality, that's almost the death knell for the plan. And then a third, I think, determining factor between success and failure is the willingness to engage and the belief in the need to engage the untapped resource of the people. It's not just something you do on the front end to get their buy-in. It's something that you manage every day. It was Joe Scanlon who said nobody knows the job better than the person who's doing it. And if you really believe that, you'll always be open to their influence.
Somewhere in the literature, there's related to Scanlon plans and processes, there's the concept of ambiguity. I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, by now it should be clear, at least we hope it's clear to your listeners, that at the outset of the roadmap, when you're beginning the process, you have no idea how it will ultimately unfold, particularly as it relates to the mechanics. There's often impatience on the part of leaders up front to say, well, we need to know right now, what will the gain-sharing process be, or the gain-sharing formula be, or how will these employees structure participation? So there's an ambiguity that you have to be willing to live with as leaders that says, if we had the answers to those questions, we wouldn't need to involve the people. But we will get better answers to those questions if we do engage them. The price we pay, and I don't think it's a particularly big price to pay, is we don't know going in what they'll come up with. But if they're responsible, and we believe they'll be responsible, and we're living by theory Y assumptions that they will step up to responsibility, they will come up with something far better than we ever could have created on our own. So ambiguity we'll live with.
All right, last wrap-up here, Bill. This just came to me. You've been a change agent with helping organizations with this kind of improvement effort for 25 to 30 years. If you were to talk to leaders who are listening to this and considering whether to go through this or not, what, from your experience, you say is the biggest reward for doing this?
Oh, it's the reward that you can't even begin to imagine. We all have, and this goes back to a D.J. Dupree belief, and D.J. was a founder of Herman Miller, a company that's well regarded as a Scanlon company. He really believed that people are not ordinary, that every person is extraordinary in his or her own way. The problem is we don't create environments where people are able to express their extraordinary gifts. We limit and we restrict, and we don't stimulate, we don't provide a nurturing environment for it. If you as a leader believe, as DJ did, that people are extraordinary, that they do have untapped potentials that we can't even begin to realize, then you will see it as your task to create the environment and the working culture whereby people freely contribute those gifts, and you will be amazed at what's there you never knew was there.
Thank you for that. Is that one definition of servant leadership?
Yes, it is.
Well,
servant leadership is really a term coined by Robert Greenleaf, but it very much dovetails with the Scanlon notion that it is the leader who needs to be very mindful of the follower and serve the follower and not be worried about being served by the follower. Bill,
any final things you'd like to say as we wrap up our discussion?
All I would point out is that if, as we've described the roadmap and the steps and the sequence and the cascading through the organization, we have attempted to be very faithful to the process. The roadmap begins with a clear statement of identity and what we must become. It works its way through engaging multiple layers of the company, first middle management, if there's a union, the union as well, the employees ultimately, so we step right from identity into the opportunity and responsibility to participate. All of it, however, with a focus on equity. The only reason for a Scanlon plan, the whole purpose of performance improvement is to assure that equilateral triangle is fair and balanced over the long term. The gain-sharing formula is just one tool for bringing that home. And then, as we pointed out at each step along the way, we always discover there are going to be demands on our competency, regardless of what level we're at, that'll be demands that have not been placed on us before. So we have to be willing to become something we never were before.
You've been listening to one of the Scanlon Leadership Network interview series. I'd like to thank our guest, Bill Greenwood, for being with us. This interview series about leadership and Scanlon business principles is brought to you by the Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation, a nonprofit association of high-performance, values-led organizations. Scanlon, where the best ideas come together. For information on the services offered by the Scanlon Leadership Network, visit their website at www.scanlonleader.org. That's on the web at scanlonleader.org. Scanlon is spelled S-C-A-N-L-O-N. Or call 517-332-8927. That's 517-332-8927. 8927. That's our interview for today. The great Scanlon leader, D.J. Dupree, taught us that every meeting with another human being should be what he called a fortuitous encounter. We are all children of God. We all have competencies and talents. The fact that we came together should make a difference. Here's wishing that all your encounters are indeed fortuitous. I'm Ron Duffy, and on behalf of the Scanlon Leadership Network, thanks for listening.